Happy holidays, embers, newbies, and the peekaboos. Welcome to Back to Ashes. I am your host, Phoenix. If this is your first time listening in to the channel and you begin to love what you're hearing, we would love to have you as part of the family. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button and don't forget to set your notification bell to all. That way you are notified every time a video is uploaded. If you are interested in learning how to become a member of the channel or would like to buy me a coffee as a special thank you, that information can be found down below. As you have been seeing scrolling across the screen, I would like to take this moment and acknowledge the elite members of Back to Ashes. Thank you all so much for being the pillars of which this channel stands. I can't thank you enough. I appreciate your support. Without further ado, it is now time to go back to ashes. For once we arise from the ashes, we are a bigger, brighter, stronger, and a happier person every day. Sit back, relax, kick back, grab a snack, or tuck in and get warm, and prepare for your dose of vocal melatonin entitled Christmas Horror Stories. Right after this intro, there will be an ad. I'll read the first story, there will be an ad, and after that, there will be no more ads within this video. Disclaimer, this video is for educational and entertainment purposes. Oh, and by the way, as you may have noticed, there is no rain ambience. This video will be set to a crackling fire with soft, eerie holiday music playing. So if you are sensitive to music, this will not be the video for you. Everyone else, here we go. For the past 2 years, I have been studying abroad in Italy, but 3 nights ago I returned home to Minnesota for Christmas break. Upon my return, I was greeted by my aunt and my 3 cousins, as well as my mother. My mother mentioned to me a few months in advance that they had been staying there for a while as their rental contract had run out on their apartment, and my uncle had been absent from July. My aunt had barely any money left and couldn't pick up a job since one of my cousins was only 5.5 months old. As I entered the living room that day, I noticed that everyone had put the tree up without me, even though there was still 2 weeks to go before Christmas. It offended me a little, but the kids didn't want to wait. My mom offered to take my bags up to my room immediately when she saw the disappointed look on my face. I followed her up there because I didn't want to be bombarded with the chaos my cousins usually bring with them. I was completely shocked when we walked straight past my bedroom and over to the loft staircase. I asked my mom why we were heading that way, and she set the bags on the floor, slowly turning around. Her face was bright red, and I recall her saying, "Well, your aunt needs a little more space, honey. She's used to sleeping in a bigger bed, and I can't imagine putting her on the couch. So we had to move you up to the loft. You understand, don't you? You've been sleeping on a cot in Italy anyway. It's exactly the same." After saying this, my mom turned back around, grabbed my luggage, and trudged up to the loft stairs. No. Our loft staircase does not have a door at the bottom, just one at the top, which doesn't even have a lock. That night was freezing cold. The loft window doesn't have a seal on it because it's centuries old. My cot bed had a broken spring, no topper, and it was made of the most uncomfortable green mesh. At least my mom had the decency to give me a spare comforter. I lay on the cot begrudgingly as I thought about my aunt and how she was living it up in my cozy room. The next day was fine. Everyone pitched in for Christmas groceries at the store. We played Jenga later at home, and no one knocked over Mom's planter this week. I took myself off to bed early and decided to read my notes for my January exams. As I was around halfway through the 3rd page, I noticed my mom was standing in the doorway holding a large flat rectangular box. I asked her what exactly she was about to do with it, but before I could even open my mouth, she set it down against the door frame. "I love you, honey," she said before leaving quickly. I shuffled over to the box and hastily laid it down, tore off the paper, and gently wiggled the item out. A mirror. She got me a mirror. I already had a mirror in my room, and it was a lot prettier than this one. This mirror looked like it was stolen from an old woman's attic. I'm not really that much of an ungrateful person, so I hung it up on the wall adjacent to the cot bed and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, the mirror fell from the wall, snapping me out of a nightmare. I was grateful, honestly, because my dream was horrifying. Anyway, I hung the mirror back up, thinking to myself about how I could prop it up on something the next day. The very next morning, the mirror was still on the wall, but facing the other way around. I went downstairs to ask my mother if she had moved it, explaining how it fell from the wall once already, but she cut me off. My mother said that she had no idea there was a mirror in the loft. I paused. For a second, I thought she was kidding, but she went on to tell me that her and my aunt had fallen asleep on the couch shortly after I went upstairs, and my cousins had been throwing Christmas ornaments at each other all night. She really didn't know about the mirror. I ran back to the loft, and to my surprise, the mirror was now the right way around on the floor. I picked it up and put it back where it was last night, but as I did so, I looked into it. I quickly noticed that the scene behind me in the mirror was not the loft, and I was not looking back at myself. Instead of my reflection, there was a window-like view of an old woman sat in an armchair. The woman was almost a fully decomposed corpse in a beautiful cottage living room. Her curly gray hair sat on top of her head like a shredded hat. The cottage window next to her was filthy and covered in dust. I was about to rush out of the room when in the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. I looked as closely as I could, but I couldn't for the life of me find anything around her corpse. My eyes flickered over the chair, and I almost threw up out of fear. Her rotting, bony fingers were still knitting. I dropped the mirror and fainted. When I woke up, I was laying on the couch, my mom hovering over me. She whispered to me, "Sweetie, I am so sorry. Your great-grandmother passed, but she swung by the house today. She made you a gift for your return home. Here you go." I sat up and cautiously unwrapped the gift. It was a homemade scarf. The town of Christian Springs was big enough to justify having its own cold storage, but far too small to make proper use of it. On average, I would end up seeing about 5 bodies a month, most of them overdoses from the smaller towns nearby. My work at the morgue was quick and impersonal. No one that I could recognize ever ended up on my table, and the toxology reports always came back with a clear-cut cause of death, usually something in the realm of opioids. What I saw in the fluorescent-lit room always stayed where it belonged. My work life and my family life were always two separate entities. That all changed during the Christmas season of 2003. 2 local bodies were brought in within 24 hours of each other. Neither of them were like anything I had ever seen. The first body belonged to Chelsea Steeler, a local first grader. After school let out for winter break, Steeler walked off the premises only to return a couple minutes later. Bleeding from her mouth, Steeler stumbled through the school's playground, begged for help, and then collapsed. She was pronounced dead as soon as emergency services arrived. The second body I recognized, Christine Morgan. Morgan was someone that most people in the Christian Springs community would recognize. She was the crazy religious lady. As the name of the town might imply, we had our fair share of Bible bumpers in town, but Morgan's breed of spirituality was considerably more aggressive than anything you could find being peddled by the televangelists the locals watched, of course. Both of these cinemas in Christian Springs banned the woman from their premises on account of her interrupting screenings of even the most milquetoast of movies with her raving sermons. When the local museum set up a dinosaur exhibit, Morgan was banned from there too. To her, dinosaur bones were the work of Satan, created to lead true believers astray. It was Christian Morgan's daughter, 7-year-old Grace Morgan, who discovered the body. When I first heard this bit of information, I found myself pitying the child. My ruminations about Grace Morgan's well-being were soon whisked away by what I discovered during the autopsies. Both of the bodies exhibited internal damage, the likes of which I had never seen or read about before. Their stomach lining was shredded to bits. Chunks of their livers were found inside of their esophagus. Every internal organ that was still intact showed signs of extreme scarring. It was as if something had torn them up from the inside. The cause of death was a complete mystery. Aside from a shared geographical location, the two women had nothing in common, yet the severity of their injuries was almost identical. It was as if someone had planted bombs inside them and sent tiny bits of shrapnel flying through their organs. Yet there was no shrapnel to be found. There was no clear trace of the instrument that had killed these women. On closer observation, however, I found something else that connected the two bodies. In the confounding mess of viscera, I found something that made their cause of death seem quaint by comparison. Even though they were bloodied and covered in loose chunks of flesh and membrane, I immediately knew what I was holding in my hands. I was holding two tiny gingerbread men. They were small, both fitting in the palm of my glove, but they still inspired fear. Unlike the big-eyed, smiling gingerbread men that were sold in the local bakeries, the creations I held in my hand had teeny slits for eyes, and their mouths were stretched into long, harrowed screams that descended well into their torsos. The baked goods I held in my hand were the product of a disturbed mind. I called just about everyone I went to school with. From the few colleagues that picked up, I couldn't find anyone who was willing to drive over and take a look at my findings. Everyone was either far too busy dealing with the personal aspects of the holiday season, or was swamped with the suicide spike that Christmas brings. Even past their business, no one believed me. When I described the two foreign objects I found lodged in the bodies, a couple of my old classmates even inquired whether I was sober. Not being able to find any explanation through my informal channels, I called my boss on the county level. His annoyance with my phone call was crystal clear. The town of Christian Springs was not on his radar, and, in his opinion, mysteries that weren't directly connected to criminal investigations were better left unexplored. After a long back and forth, he agreed to drive down and investigate the gingerbread men as soon as his schedule cleared up. He suggested that I shouldn't go into details on my report if I didn't want to undergo a psychological evaluation. I filled out the report as best that I could, but the cause of death still ended up as unknown. After a couple more phone calls to old colleagues who didn't pick up the first time around, I gave up. The mystery of the gingerbread men would have to wait until after the holidays. I placed the cookie creatures face down in a glass jar, put on my coat, and drove back home. My wife don't like me talking about work at home. In fact, she didn't like me talking about work at all. Whenever the question for what I did for a living came up at dinner parties, she'd quickly say I worked with the police or call me a doctor and then quickly change the topic. When I came home that evening, I didn't mention anything about the gingerbread men, but all night long those slitted eyes haunted me. I dreamed of my son walking into our bedroom in the middle of the night, clutching his stomach. I dreamed of my wife getting up to comfort him, but soon kneeling over in pain as well. I dreamed of my family lying on those metal slabs, of me cutting their chests open, of finding nothing but pink mush where their organs should be. When I woke up that morning, I was overjoyed to find my wife sleeping next to me, unharmed by the baked monstrosities that tore through my sleep. But the joy didn't last that long. My family might have been alive, but those two gingerbread men were still real. They were still waiting for me in the examination room. During breakfast, my son excitedly told me about his last day of school. I knew he went on a field trip to the museum. I signed the permission form for it after all. But all my son could talk about was the gingerbread men his class made in the morning. I kept on trying to ask him what his favorite dinosaur exhibit was, but all my son could talk about was his newfound interest in baking. The house phone rang. My wife picked it up. Whatever was being said on the other line made her visibly uncomfortable, but when she came back to the table, she simply resumed eating. It wasn't until my son went outside to play with his friends that she told me that the school called. One of my son's classmates suddenly died. The teachers were calling the parents to let them know now. "Chelsea Steeler?" I asked. She immediately noticed the beginning of a conversation she didn't want to have. "Let's not tell him until after Christmas. Let him be a kid for a little longer." I didn't argue. I didn't share the details of what I found inside of Steeler's body. Instead, I told my wife that there was some last-minute paperwork I had to take care of in the examination room before I fully clocked out for the holidays. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did spend some more time going through the autopsy report, making sure it didn't sound completely mad. But it wasn't the reason I drove back to work that day. My real reasons were laying face down in a glass jar. Yet, when I took the jar out, the gingerbread men weren't laying down. They were pressed up against the glass, facing the outside world. There was no doubt in my mind that the creatures had shifted, that they had somehow stood up in my absence and were looking out into the world with their slitted eyes. For a moment, I stood there, confounded by the blood-covered baked good staring back at me. Yet, the longer I stood in the empty examination room, the more I thought about my family. Beyond the corpses, beyond the ripped-up muscle and flesh, I had a family. Back home, my wife and son were waiting for me. I closed the cupboard that held the gingerbread men, shut off the lights, and drove back home. It was difficult to keep the malformed creatures out of my head on the drive back. But as soon as I got past my front door, the mysteries of my professional life dissipated beneath the sheer pleasure of spending time with my family. After lunch, the three of us went outside to build a snowman. 2 big eyes of Christmas ornaments, a thick carrot nose, and a wide grin of coal. The creature that my son had constructed wiped away any memory of the harrowing gingerbread men in the examination room. Once the snowman in our front yard had been completed and the sun had set, the three of us settled down on the couch and watched a Christmas movie. I scarcely paid attention to what was on the television. Whatever was on the screen was irrelevant, just a bright backdrop to a calm evening spent with those that I loved. It wasn't until my wife and I were falling asleep that I thought about my work again. Just as she drifted off to sleep, she mentioned that we should have a talk with our son about bullying. While I was off finishing my paperwork, my son told my wife about one of his classmates tormenting the daughter of the weird religious lady. Apparently, the bully had taken the girl's gingerbread man and ate it in front of the entire class, embarrassing the poor kid. "Christine Morgan's daughter?" I asked. "Probably," my wife said, yawning. Was the bully Chelsea Steeler? I asked. Don't know. He didn't use names, she said, yawning again. But she would talk to him about standing up for the weaker kids. For a moment, I thought about breaking the unspoken rules of my marriage and telling my wife about the 2 corpses in the examination room. But that moment dragged on for too long. By the time I started to whisper my worries, she was already asleep. My mind was still desperately trying to make connections between the 2 bodies and their gruesome deaths. But I forced my eyes shut and tried to get some rest. I hoped that some sleep would help me forget about the gingerbread men. It didn't. I woke up drenched in sweat with my heart racing. In my dreams, I saw my family sitting in the kitchen making gingerbread men. My wife and son seemed so happy, so full of life, so innocent. Yet, the cookies that they made shared none of their joy. Slitted eyes and maws of crimson stared back at me from the kitchen table. Slitted eyes that blinked and maws that chomped. Before I could warn them, before I could save my family, the gingerbread men leapt into action. Soon enough, my wife and son were gone, and all that remained of them was blood and mangled skin. Seeing the kitchen clean and free of death brought a tiny bit of calmness to my mind. But I knew that what I truly needed was sleep. With a generous helping of sleeping pills and a nightcap, I returned back to bed. At first, the thoughts of Morgan and Steeler tugged at my mind, but soon enough I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke to an empty bed that morning. For a moment, past the chemically induced grogginess of my slumber, I found myself worrying about my family being kidnapped by a bunch of possessed gingerbread men. Walking down to the kitchen and finding my wife and son safe and sound calmed me, somewhat. But the calmness didn't last. They were baking gingerbread men. Their creations were unlike the ones I had seen in my dream. The cookie men they made were cheery and happy and full of pep. But that didn't matter to me. All I could think about were those slitted eyes and screaming maws. All I could think about were the 2 gingerbread men standing in my office, waiting. They invited me to join in on the baking, but I busied myself with beer and television. I hoped that alcohol and channel hopping would distract me, yet all I could think about were the bodies. Regardless of how much I drank or how loud the Christmas music blaring from the television was, all I could think about was Morgan, Steeler, and the cookie men that were lodged in their broken corpses. My mind kept on trying to find some semblance of reason in a bewildering world. Daddy, I made you something. My son's voice cut through my frenzied internal monologue. In his hands, he held a little gingerbread man with a bushy mustache and glasses. The facial hair was made of green frosting, and the glasses far too big for the man's face. But I could tell that the gingerbread man was meant to be a representation of me. Do you go to school with Grace Morgan? I asked him. He seemed confused by the question, but eventually he nodded. Did Grace ever talk about her mother? Did they get along? I asked him. Gracie's mom was mean, my son said. When the class went to the museum, Gracie's mom was standing outside yelling at us. But did Grace ever talk about her mother? Do you think Grace would ever want to hurt her? Would Grace ever want to hurt Chelsea Steeler? Well, Gracie's mom didn't let her come to the museum with us, and Chelsea was always mean to Gracie, my son said, unsure of my questions. Do you like this gingerbread man I made you? I didn't, even though the cookie held an innocent smile and was made by the most important person in my life. I could barely look at it. Yet, as uncomfortable as I was, the pride in my son's eyes was undeniable. I accepted his cookie. I knew full well that the effigy in my hands was a product of love, but all I could imagine was the little gingerbread man tearing through my insides. "Are you going to eat it, Dad?" he asked. "I promise it's not bad. Mom helped me." I almost told him that I wasn't hungry or that I would eat the cookie later, but the pride in my son's eyes was undeniable. The pride in my son's eyes was more important than the fear in the pit of my stomach. In one swift motion, I decapitated the gingerbread man with my teeth. Once I was sure his head was crushed enough to not do me any harm, I drowned the chunks of gingerbread man with a gulp of beer. "Tasty," I said, but I wasn't able to mask my discomfort. That evening, as my wife and I wrapped up the Christmas presents, she asked me if I was all right. Both her and my son had noticed that something was bothering me. That evening, she was willing to talk about my problems, be they work-related or not. Yet, by then, my fear of the gingerbread men had grown to such an intensity that it could not be put into words. I just told her that work was a bit more stressful than usual this year, but that I would be fine eventually. She asked me if I wanted to talk about it. I didn't. I couldn't. She tried to get me to open up a couple more times, but eventually, with the lights off and the presents packed beneath the tree, I was left alone with my thoughts. My thoughts were singular. I shouldn't have been driving that night. I had drank enough throughout the day for it to be a bad idea, and to make things worse, there was a powerful blizzard that swept through the town that Christmas Eve. Yet, I knew that unless I got some closure, I wouldn't be able to sleep. I drove through the curtain of snow until I could see the faint lights of the Christian Springs morgue. The absurdity of it all was a steady drum beat in the back of my head. But it wasn't until I was standing in the darkness of my office that I consciously acknowledged how insane my trip was. There was nothing to be achieved from closer examination. Morgan and Steeler were dead. There was nothing I could do to bring them back. I almost convinced myself to turn around and go back home. Almost. Just as I was about to turn around and walk away, I heard something. I heard the faintest of taps coming from the cupboard in which I kept the gingerbread men. Tap, tap, tap. Like little claws knocking on glass. Tap, tap, tap. Like little gingerbread men trying to make their way out. Tap, tap, tap. With my heart in my throat, I opened up the cupboard. Stuck in their glass prison, the two gingerbread men just stood there, staring straight at me. They were no longer standing in the spread-out pose in which I first found them. Each of them had one of their blood-caked limbs extended, as if they were about to knock on the glass again. I stared at them, waiting for them to move again, waiting for something to happen that would convince me that I had not gone insane. In the dim light of my office, I thought I could see their eyes twitch. I thought I could see the slightest bit of stifled movement in their mouths. But before I could steady myself to properly look, my phone rang. It was my wife. She woke up in the middle of the night to find her husband missing, to find the car missing. She asked 2 questions. She asked whether I was safe and whether I was having an affair. The implication that I would even be capable of being unfaithful hurt me. But as I assured her that I would never break our marriage vows, I realized how far I had let my mind drift. I closed the cupboard, slid down to the floor of the examination room, and told her everything. I told her about Steeler and Morgan's unfathomable internal damage. I told her about the gingerbread men. I told her about how scared I was. She listened patiently, and with each word that left my lips, with each part of my insane story that I described, I found myself less and less scared. The cause of death was still a mystery, but the pure act of examining the gingerbread men theory made it seem inconceivable. The murderous gingerbread men were not real. What was real was my worried wife, who was waiting for me at home. Once I was all talked out, she asked me to come home, and I did. As I shut off the lights and left the examination room, however, the tiniest bit of doubt slithered into my mind. Tap, tap, tap. I ignored it and drove back home. The steadily rotating cast of extended family members that came through our house kept me occupied for the next couple of days. All worries of murderous gingerbread men disappeared beneath the fear that my mother-in-law inspired in me. But the fear wasn't something that haunted my dreams. That fear was manageable. When my wife and I decided to tell our son about Chelsea Steeler, he didn't seem overly concerned. Apparently, his friends had already told him. Just about everyone from his class knew as soon as the playground rumor mill got going. He just never brought it up because he knew that Mommy didn't like talking about death in the house. The kid seemed more comfortable about the concept of mortality, but what can one expect from a child whose father works with the police? A day before New Year's, I got called back into work. Another overdose from a town nearby. The ghastly gingerbread men had left my mind completely by then. I simply co-signed them to be a part of some minor mental breakdown. Yet, when I entered the examination room, the thoughts of those slitted eyes came flooding back. The cupboard was open and there was broken glass on the floor. The gingerbread men had escaped. I spent most of January sleepless. I kept on thinking that somehow these two strange creatures made of gingerbread would come and track me down, that they would hurt my family and me, because I was aware of their existence. But they didn't. Life carried on as normal. My boss agreed that Morgan and Steeler's injuries were difficult to explain, but he also insisted that they were not important enough to investigate. After the first day of classes, my son informed me that Grace Morgan left town to go live with her grandparents and that no one was particularly sad with the school bully disappearing off campus. Once it became clear that no murderous baked goods were coming after me and my family, the thoughts of those slit-eyed creatures drifted away into the realm of pointless mystery. I still don't understand what I saw that Christmas of 2003, but I have resigned myself to the fact that I will never understand. Sometimes, however, when I find myself sitting in a bar after a medical examiner conference and colleagues start sharing stories of the bizarre and unexplained, I tell my tale of the gingerbread men. And sometimes, when the booze is flowing freely and people's tongues loosen, they tell me that I am not the only coroner who has found baked goods inside of a mangled corpse. Unexplained events have been happening ever since last week when my first Amazon mystery package arrived. It all started last Monday when a white, unmarked van rolled up to my house that morning. An elderly woman with long, unruly gray curls crawled out, carrying a large package wrapped in red ribbon to my porch. Oh, how nice, I thought. Who's this from? I admit I kind of hoped it was from a secret admirer, but I doubted it. Get real, Brent, I told myself. But I hadn't ordered anything from Amazon since last month, when I finished my Christmas shopping. What could this be? I carried the package into the kitchen and opened it. Inside the box were layers of festive green, red, and reindeer-printed tissue paper. But the box looked empty. After searching some more, an envelope sealed with a gold sticker appeared at the bottom of the box. Mr. Smith was scrawled across the envelope in large, sloppy crayon letters. A child's handwriting. But what child would send this? Besides, I didn't have, or even know, any children. Who could send such a strange gift? And why go to such trouble to wrap a note? Why not just mail the card instead? Inside the envelope was a thin strip of paper that looked like a fortune from the inside of a cookie, but the paper was flamingo pink instead of white. The note read, "A child will be born." That was it. No signature, no explanation, no note underneath saying, "Just kidding." Huh? I asked out loud. A child? What on earth? I grabbed my phone and dialed my sister. "Hey, Claire," I said, "did you send me a present from Amazon?" She laughed. No, sorry," she said, sounding confused. "Why do you ask?" "Someone sent me an Amazon package with a note in it, and I'm trying to solve the mystery." She said, sounding as confused as I felt. "Who knows? Maybe you have a secret admirer," she laughed. Then I laughed, probably a little too loudly. "Funny today, aren't we?" "Well, Brent," she said. "Not to change the subject, but since we're on the phone, I might as well tell you the news." Her voice burst with energy, sounding giddy. "Oh yeah?" I asked, still thinking about the freak show of a package that had just arrived at my door. "Guess what?" What?" "I'm pregnant," she squealed, like a senior at an after-prom party. "Oh my God," I exclaimed, shocked and a bit horrified. Who's the father?" Claire hadn't mentioned seeing anyone special for months, but she sounded so excited about the news I had to ask. She paused, sighing. It's probably Randy," she said. "From my yoga class. We just started dating. Good guy though. Vegan, low sugar, gluten-free, you know. Sometimes he smokes hash, but whatever. We all have our vices." "Oh?" I asked, my tone equal parts polite and curious. But goosebumps rippled over my skin as I reread the note from the Amazon package. "A child will be born." Was this some kind of joke? I wondered. Who's behind this? The next morning, around the same time, I was working at my computer when car tires squealed into the driveway. An engine huffed and hummed. I peeked through the blinds. It was the same Amazon delivery woman from yesterday, carrying another large package wrapped in red ribbon. This time I greeted her at the door. "How you doing today?" she said with a jarringly loud Boston accent. "Pretty good, and you?" She nodded. Could be better," she grunted, then turned to walk away. Hey," I said before she left. "Do you know how I could find out who sent the package I got yesterday?" She shrugged. "Call customer service," she said, then walked away before I'd finished speaking. With the holiday madness, I'd never get anyone on the phone. Why bother, I figured. After waiting a few moments, I opened the package and read ribbon, sighing. Here we go again. Just like before, another ocean of green, red, and reindeer printed tissue paper greeted me, bursting from the box with Christmas cheer. I waded through the forest of tissue paper, then grabbed the envelope at the bottom of the box. Again, like before, my name was scrawled across the front of the envelope in crayon. Inside the envelope was another thin pink strip of paper, but this one read, "A puppy will arrive, but warning, appearances deceive." A puppy? I said under my breath. What? I set the envelope on the counter, then returned to work. Whatever, I thought. An hour later, just as I was finishing a report for my boss, a knock sounded at my door. A boy of about 10 or 12 stood on the porch looking sad. "Hey there," I said. "What can I do for you?" He clasped his hands behind him like he was holding on to something. "Hey," he said, flashing a nervous smile. "I'm Bradley. Then, after a moment, he unclasped his arms, swinging them around to reveal a tiny Pomeranian on a silver leash. Bradley handed me the leash. "Please take care of him," he said. "Oh no," I started. I can't." But before I could object, the boy darted off, bolting down the street like an Olympian sprinter, then vanished around the corner. I looked down at the puppy, wagging its tail and smiling. Around his collar was a bone-shaped name tag that read, Buster. No address, no telephone number, no owners. Just Buster. "Oh my," I said. "Who would name you such a thing?" I pet him, stroking his rust-colored fur as he wagged his tail and smiled. Oh well, I thought. Had wanted to adopt a rescue dog anyway. This might work out after all. "Well, Buster," I said, "welcome home." The third morning played out just like the 2 mornings before. Same delivery woman, same box, same ribbon, same envelope, different note. This time, the tone was more ominous. The note read, "Lock your doors. Someone's watching." Chills rippled up my spine and I shuddered. Buster barked, sounding uncharacteristically aggressive. He growled like a pit bull, looking at nothing in particular in the living room. I followed his gaze as he looked up at something several inches shorter than me, but still much taller than him. But I saw nothing significant aside from a bland living room. But just to be safe, I locked the front door, then walked through every room of the house to secure the windows and doors. But in the spare bedroom, the window was cracked open, at just the right amount of space for someone to crawl through. The white linen curtains billowed in the winter breeze like an omen. On the windowsill was a pink post-it that read, "Lock me." I followed the instructions without question. Later that night, I looked back at the Amazon box that had arrived that day, searching for signs of the sender's identity, but found nothing. I flipped on the television, letting it play in the background while I worked at my computer. The voices on the TV droned on like background noise until one report caught my ear. "Breaking news tonight," an anchorwoman announced. "Here's the latest on what police say is the work of a phantom burglar. Good evening, Chad. What's the latest?" "Good evening, Shannon," the male reporter said. "Police say the phantom burglar has struck again, this time in an unexpected location. Around 7 this evening, the burglar frightened an elderly couple in the quiet, low-key Turtle Bluffs neighborhood at their home near Chadwick and Foothill Roads." "My God," I gasped. "That's right here. That's this neighborhood. No, wait. That's right around the corner." The camera flashed to the home of the scene, a small yellow house on the corner right around the street from my house. The couple that had been victimized lived 20 seconds away. Holy shit. I thought of the note from earlier, along with the open spare bedroom window from the morning. My heart thumped and my stomach flip-flopped as the chunks rose up my throat. Who was sending these letters? And how did this person know so much? The next morning, when the package arrived, I hesitated before reading the note. I paced back and forth in front of the unopened envelope for a while, contemplating whether to even open it. Finally, unable to resist, I opened it. This time the note read, "Don't look in the mirror." "Say what?" I said out loud. "How am I supposed to do that?" I set the strip of paper on the counter and forgot about it. I returned to my desk to finish my report. Still, I avoided mirrors for the rest of the day. I figured, well, technically I was working from home, so I could loaf around all day looking like shit, and who would care? That night, I turned on the news, half expecting to hear another crazy report, but I heard nothing unusual. I went to sleep that night without trouble and woke up at around 6 the next morning to the sound of a loud crash. Buster barked and growled like a savage beast. For a 5-pound dog, he had the bark and growl of a demon-possessed Doberman. I looked at him, alarmed. What was that noise? I grabbed a baseball bat out of the closet and crept through the house, listening for movement. Silence. I rounded the corner to the staircase and tiptoed down the stairs. The floorboard above me creaked. I jerked my head up to look, but nothing was there. The morning sunshine was creeping through the darkness now, streaming its first rays of sun into the entryway, bathing the staircase in a soft golden light, looking serene and ethereal. I crept across the entryway, toward the living room and kitchen, pressing my body against the wall, police style, before rounding the next corner. No one. Then, down the hallway, outside the guest bedroom, I found shards of glass sprinkled all throughout the carpet, forming a trail from the hall to the bathroom. I flipped on the light. The entire wall-to-wall mirror in the guest bathroom had been busted out. The entire mirror had shattered. Later, after the police arrived to check out the scene, they shook their heads, baffled, looking around for clues of some crime, but finding nothing. No idea how that happened, one of the policemen said, shaking his head as he scribbled into a notepad without looking up. I've never heard of a mirror breaking apart on its own before. He grunted. That's some weird shit. He kept scribbling his notes, never looking up. I nodded. He handed me his business card. Have a nice day, he said without a hint of emotion, with the same tone he'd used to order a grilled cheese sandwich at dinner. Call if you need anything, he said. The final note arrived Friday morning, December 18th. But this one was the worst of all. I greeted the delivery woman at the door as she crept up the porch at the speed of a sea turtle treading through a wading pool. Good morning, you, she said, smiling. She reached over and pinched my cheek. I wasn't expecting that and just smiled awkwardly. But this time, she was wearing a name tag, Gertrude Morris. I thanked her, took the package, and opened it inside. I opened the envelope inside the box and read the note, bracing myself. They didn't survive. At that moment, all the frustration and the confusion and the apprehension and all-around creepiness of the past week closed in on me, and I had had enough. Enough! I yelled at the empty room. What is this? A joke? Well, not funny. Silence. I went to work at my computer, trying to put the image of the last note out of my head. I typed up my report for work. I waited, wringing my hands, pacing across my kitchen, back and forth, a few times waiting for something to happen, waiting to hear some kind of terrible news. I imagined turning on the news and hearing some horror story about an accident or a robbery or worse. But the hours passed by without trouble or tragedy. That night, I went to sleep around midnight, wondering if the whole drama had ended. Soon, I drifted off into a dreamless sleep. The next day, an hour earlier than usual, I took Buster for a walk and discovered the package already sitting on the porch. I waited for Buster to emerge from the shrubbery, then I picked up the package off the doorstep. This one was wrapped in green ribbon, and inside, on the card, my name was typed. Curious, I opened the envelope, expecting to see the usual strip of paper. But instead, I found a surprise. Inside the envelope was a pink Post-it that read, "Look in the box." I returned to the box, digging through the jungle of wrapping paper, and pulled out a rolled-up newspaper. I peeled off the rubber band and unrolled it. On the front page was the date, December 11th, 2020. As I unrolled it, a collage of faces appeared under one article entitled, 101 dead in Albany plane crash. I'd heard all about that last week. Tragic story. But why was the newspaper in the box? I wondered. I slipped on my reading glasses and studied the faces of the deceased passengers. The plane had crashed soon after takeoff. Engine failure, killing almost everyone on board. But when I looked at the passenger's face, I froze. Wait, I thought. I recognize some of these faces. As I matched faces to names, my heart raced. 2 pictures caught my eye as I read. One was a photo of a dark-haired boy with a nervous smile along with the caption, "Bradley Bennett, age 11, Albany, New York, killed." The other was a photo of a smiling elderly woman with long gray curls with the caption, "Gertrude Morris, aged 81, Boston, Massachusetts, killed." My jaw dropped as all the pieces of the mystery fell into place. The boy on the doorstep with the dog, the Amazon delivery woman who had delivered the packages almost every day this week. But when I looked back at the article, a line of blue ink caught my eye under one of the captions. It looked like someone's handwriting. It read, "Sorry about the mirror. I didn't mean it." I froze in disbelief. But how could this be? I didn't know. I still don't know. But what I do know is the events of the past week have challenged things I thought I knew and believed in. Oh, and about that package I got with the newspaper. It was the last one I got. I haven't seen Gertrude since. Jessie looked at me in wonderment, Christmas lights twinkling above her head. Jessie had been a much sought-after blessing, one that we had paid thousands for in years and agonizing treatments and trials. Jessie was testament that miracles could happen, and she was a gift that kept giving to us. The snow started to tumble delicately down, flakes settling with abandonment where they fell. It couldn't have been more perfect. The ideal Christmas setting. Life was a bounty of beauty and serenity. We were ensconced in a Hallmark movie scene. Watching Michael with our daughter, wine in hand, I couldn't feel more contented. I didn't know if the flush was from the wine or being present in the moment. I was so entranced that I failed to hold the glass tight enough, and the red wine escaped the shattered glass, pooling at Michael's feet. But it wasn't red wine, and Michael was no longer standing. The liquid was too thick. How did it get up the walls? Why was it sprayed up the fire? Confusion enveloped me as a scream escaped from my mouth. Why was Michael on the floor? Why was Jessie now slumped over him? Jessie, my beautiful Jessie. I tried to get out of my chair, but I felt like I was being pushed back. The lights were brighter over my head. Why couldn't I get to Jessie? Jessie! Jessie! I was screaming as everything faded to black. The snow tumbled with abandon as I looked out of the window. Michael passed me a glass of wine as I watched our beautiful Jessie underneath the Christmas lights. She was laughing, her eyes twinkling, as she gently fingered the dress of the angel. I saw her jump up to her daddy as she waited to be balanced on his shoulders as they put the angel on the tree. I laughed with them. Happiness surrounded our family as we relished our Christmas tradition. The wine escaped my hand as I moved to help Jessie return to the ground. It spilled across the floor surrounding the fire and seemed to flood the walls with its red spray. I watched in horror as I looked around and saw Jessie slumped over her father. Her new dress seemed to be stuck to her body, like she'd worn it wet. I seemed to realize I was screaming her name as Michael tried to talk, blood bubbling from his lips. I tried to reach him, help him, save him from what I didn't understand, but I couldn't seem to move. I was walking through treacle, screaming his name as everything faded to black. I was sitting somewhere I didn't recognize. There was no snow at the window. There was no tree or fire. Fear ran through my body. Where was I? I tried to lift my hands, but they were strapped to the arms of the chair. Screams erupted from my mouth as I begged for Michael and Jesse. Where are they? Where was I? The only thing I could taste was my fear. The door I hadn't even noticed to the left opened. Screaming again, I begged to be let go. Where is Jesse? Where is Michael? I cried out. A man entered and grabbed a chair from the wall and sat down in front of me. Terror washed over me. A familiarity of this man made my bladder empty its content. I was scared into silence as he began to talk. Anne-Marie, don't be scared. We have been through this, and you know who I am. Bewilderment continued to mute me as I watched his lips start to move again. Anne-Marie, we can't keep going through this. It's been 17 years. You are in the Arundel Mental Hospital, and you are safe. He took another breath as I began to scrape the wood underneath my hands. You are restrained for your own safety, so please don't try to rip them off again. It will hurt you, and you will be sedated. Looking at my arms, I see unfamiliar white lines and scratches, some old and some appeared new. Dried blood had appeared to pool at the bottom of my wrists. Anne-Marie, he began, his voice startling me to the present again. We need to discuss the screaming in your room, calling for Michael and Jesse. You know they aren't there. You know what happened that day. You know it was you who had the knife and confronted Michael and Jesse at the Christmas tree. You are the one that lit the match. I know I started to scream again. I know I called their names. I screamed a scream so visceral I knew it could all fade away. But it didn't fade to black. He was still opposite me. I was still strapped in the chair, and the dawning of my realization was written all over his face. And that, dear Embers, brings a close to these Christmas horror stories. I'd like to take a moment and thank our members of Back to Ashes, as well as the newbies and the peekaboos. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Deeply and truly, without you, I would not have a voice, and this channel would not be Back to Ashes. Thank you so much for all of your support. If you're sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you comfortably. If you're awake, I hope you've enjoyed these selections. Until next time, please take care of yourselves and always stay vigilant. Have yourself a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. Peace, love, light, and happy holidays to you all.